On the morning of December 23, 1942, at precisely 0800 hours, Lieutenant General Hirokichi Hyakutake sat hunched over a rough wooden table in his damp, stifling command bunker on Guadalcanal, drafting a radio message that stripped away every comforting illusion still clinging to the Japanese campaign in the Solomons. A message so stark that it would later stand as one of the most devastating admissions in the history of the Imperial Japanese Army, for in a few unadorned sentences he informed Tokyo that his 17th Army had essentially no food left, that his men were physically incapable of conducting even basic reconnaissance patrols, and that he therefore requested permission to continue fighting until his force was completely destroyed, an extraordinary plea that acknowledged total operational collapse while simultaneously clinging to the cultural imperative of annihilation rather than withdrawal. At that moment Hyakutake nominally commanded roughly 11,000 men scattered across nearly 90 miles of jungle, men weakened by starvation, malaria, dysentery, and exhaustion, supplied only by destroyers of the Tokyo Express that could dash down the slot under cover of darkness, unload a mere 110 troops and about 2 weeks' worth of rations per ship, and flee before dawn to avoid American aircraft flying from Henderson Field. And the numbers embedded in that bleak reality had been screaming their warning for months, even though no one with the authority to halt the catastrophe had been willing to listen, because the story of how those numbers metastasized into approximately 24,000 Japanese dead began not with Hyakutake's radio confession, but 2 months earlier with a decision that violated every principle of logistics, physiology, and common sense, a decision rooted in faith that spirit could conquer arithmetic. On October 26, 1942, following a catastrophic frontal assault on Henderson Field that had cost roughly 1,500 Japanese lives in a single night, Hyakutake faced a moment that should have forced strategic reckoning, as his shattered 2nd Division pulled back in disarray. His transport ships were being sunk faster than they could deliver rice, and destroyer captains were increasingly loading artillery shells instead of food simply to keep their guns firing, circumstances under which any commander grounded in logistical reality would have consolidated his forces near the coast where the Tokyo Express could still reach them, but instead, at 0800 hours that morning, Hyakutake issued an order that effectively sentenced 3,000 men to death by starvation when he directed Colonel Toshinari Shoji's right-wing detachment to march east to Koli Point, 13 miles from the nearest supply line, to guard against a feared American landing that existed more in Japanese imagination than in American planning. Shoji's 3,000 soldiers stepped off into the jungle carrying full ammunition pouches and shrinking rice rations, marching away from the only reliable source of food on the island, and within days 2 Marine Raider companies and 2 U.S. Army battalions would converge on them in coconut groves near Gavaga Creek, supported by 75mm pack howitzers capable of throwing 6-kilogram shells nearly 8,000 yards with devastating precision, but American firepower, lethal as it was, would not prove to be the true executioner of Shoji's command, because that role would be played instead by a narrow, swampy gap in the American encirclement, a muddy creek bed only a few hundred yards wide that the Marines could not fully seal, through which more than 2,000 Japanese soldiers would slip away into the jungle interior with no supply line behind them and no food ahead, vanishing into a green abyss that would devour them more effectively than any artillery barrage. What followed was Lieutenant Colonel Evans Carlson's legendary long patrol, 700 Marine Raiders accompanied by native scouts and sustained by scheduled resupply points, relentlessly hunting a starving column through the same jungle where Japanese soldiers were already collapsing from hunger and disease, and while Carlson's men would kill 488 Japanese soldiers in 17 days of bitter fighting, starvation would kill far more, so that by the time the remnants of Shoji's force staggered back into Japanese lines near Kokumbona in early December, only about 700 men remained from the original 3,000, most of them skeletal, sick, and unfit for combat, living proof of a mathematical truth as brutal as it was simple. You cannot march and fight 3,000 men through hostile jungle for 6 weeks without a supply chain and expect them to survive. Hyakutake had gambled that Japanese willpower could overcome Japanese arithmetic, and in doing so he lost not only Shoji's detachment but ultimately some 24,000 lives, proving with terrible clarity that in modern war the ration scale always defeats the battle flag. When radio static crackled through the underground command post at 1,700 hours on December 23 carrying Hyakutake's message across 800 miles of ocean to Rabaul and onward to Tokyo, its blunt language hung in the humid air like an indictment, but for the staff officers bent over maps and ledgers it came 2 months too late, because the numbers leading to that admission had been visible since October, written plainly in shipping manifests and destroyer capacity reports that no one had bothered to read with sufficient honesty. On the morning of October 23, those same officers had been planning what Hyakutake called the decisive assault on Henderson Field, radiating confidence as they studied operational maps showing nearly 20,000 Japanese troops on Guadalcanal, including 7,000 assault troops of the 2nd Division positioned south of the airfield in what appeared to be ideal attacking formations, their plan elegantly simple. Overwhelm the marine perimeter in concentrated night attacks. Seize Henderson Field, and strangle American air power in the Solomons. A plan born of experience in China and Southeast Asia where shock tactics and aggressive infantry assaults had shattered opponents who lacked depth, firepower, or logistical resilience. The attack began at 2,100 hours on October 24th with preparatory fires from mountain guns and mortars followed by infantry charges through the jungle south of Henderson Field, Japanese soldiers advancing with Type 99 Arisaka rifles and Type 96 light machine guns, bayonets fixed for close combat, only to be annihilated by Marines armed with M1 Garands, Browning automatic rifles, and 37mm anti-tank guns firing canister rounds that sprayed hundreds of steel balls across narrow jungle approaches, turning them into abattoirs, so that by dawn on October 25th the 2nd Division had lost over 1,500 men in that sector alone for fewer than 60 American dead, a lopsided result that should have forced a fundamental reassessment, but instead prompted staff discussions focused on tactical refinements rather than strategic reality. As if better routes or artillery positioning could compensate for an inability to feed an army isolated 400 kilometers from its base and supplied only by destroyers that could operate for a few hours each night. At 0800 on October 26, Hyakutake canceled further frontal assaults but issued the order that defined the rest of the campaign, withdrawing the main force while sending Shoji's detachment eastward, a decision reflecting his continued faith in maneuver and offensive spirit even as his supply situation collapsed. For the Tokyo Express could deliver only fixed amounts of cargo while Japanese troop strength on the island continued to rise based on reinforcement schedules drawn up months earlier, under assumptions that no longer applied. Shoji accepted his orders without protest, though his records later revealed concern about supply, and his men marched off carrying standard equipment and roughly 1 week of rations, veterans of tropical warfare whose weapons were effective and whose training was superb, yet none of that mattered because there was no supply line between Koli Point and any source of food. Japanese logistics on Guadalcanal rested on assumptions that had worked elsewhere, that frontline troops would remain within reach of supply dumps and that operations would conclude before stocks ran out. Assumptions obliterated by American control of Henderson Field and the grinding persistence of the campaign, but as Shoji vanished into the jungle. Headquarters routines continued with meticulous record-keeping that tracked ammunition and casualties while ignoring calories and consumption rates, reflecting an institutional blindness that treated logistics as an administrative afterthought rather than the foundation of operations. Across the lines, Major General Alexander van de Grift studied intelligence reports with growing concern, fearing an eastern thrust that could threaten his flank, and responded by landing Marine raiders and Army troops at Aula Bay, extending American reach and tightening the noose around Shoji's force, whose first clashes with U.S. units demonstrated both tactical competence and strategic doom, as American artillery and coordinated infantry maneuvers forced them into retreat, eventually leaving that fatal swamp gap through which thousands escaped only to condemn themselves to starvation. Carlson's raiders, supplied every 4 days and guided by Solomon Islander scouts like the legendary Jacob Vuzza, hunted the column relentlessly, their logistical system emphasizing mobility and endurance, a stark contrast to Shoji's men who carried no resupply and no medical support, and as firefights erupted along rivers and jungle trails, it became increasingly clear that while the Japanese could still fight, they could not survive. By mid-November, Shoji's column had exhausted its rice. Wounded men died first, then the sick, malaria and dysentery-ravaged bodies already hollowed by hunger, boots disintegrated, rifles became walking sticks, and men collapsed beside jungle trails, while destroyer runs from Shortland Island could no longer reach scattered units inland. And Shoji himself understood the arithmetic well enough to know that 0 food plus 60 miles of jungle equaled death. Carlson's patrol, though also ravaged by disease, endured because logistics sustained it, because men could be evacuated, resupplied, and treated, while Shoji faced impossible choices between abandoning the weak or slowing the entire column, choices that ended the same way regardless. By the time Carlson was ordered back in early December, his raiders had killed 488 Japanese at the cost of 16 dead, while Shoji's survivors, perhaps 700 men capable of walking, finally reached Japanese lines near Kokumbona, skeletal and broken, providing undeniable proof of a disaster months in the making. Yet even then Hyakutake's staff clung to optimism, focusing on tactics while American strength on Guadalcanal surged past 50,000 men with ample supplies, artillery, tanks, and medical facilities, and Japanese positions around Mount Austin and the Matanicaw deteriorated into desperate strongpoints defended by starving soldiers with little ammunition and no hope of evacuation. When Hyakutake finally sent his December 23 radio message, admitting that his army had no food and requesting permission to fight to extinction, Tokyo at last acknowledged reality, approving Operation Coup, the evacuation of Guadalcanal, a tacit admission that courage could not compensate for logistics. Between February 1 and 9, 1943, roughly 10,652 Japanese were evacuated, many requiring immediate medical care, and while the operation demonstrated what Japanese forces could achieve with planning and resources, it also underscored the catastrophic cost of earlier decisions. In the final accounting, approximately 24,000 Japanese soldiers died on Guadalcanal, fewer than half from combat, the rest from starvation, disease, and exhaustion, victims not of American firepower alone but of institutional failure, of a command culture that believed spirit could replace supply, and of a decision made on October 26 that sent 3,000 men marching away from food into the jungle, a decision whose consequences rippled outward until an entire army was destroyed. Proving with merciless clarity that in modern war, survival is governed not by valor alone but by logistics, calories, medicine, and the unforgiving arithmetic of human endurance.